Let's take a deeper look into this concept of parameters. So things you need to know from the video: what's a method header? What is the method signature? Two types of parameters are defined: a formal parameter, which you will hear me just call parameter, and an actual parameter, which I will refer to as the argument, and method overloading. You'll find this stuff in chapter 3.1, and there's a little bit there at W3 Schools. I had this graphic earlier called the method machine, and you input data into the method machine, bunch of statements in the method, outcomes and output. Parameters are these variables here. The variables that are going into the method machine as input is the parameter. Let's take a look on why use parameters in a method. Here are two recipes, and they're both for cookies. And one of these recipes will bake 20 cookies. This one to the right is the recipe to bake 40 cookies. Now, suppose I needed to bake 80 cookies. Do I need a new recipe? And I hope you agree, no. If I parameterize this recipe, just like you put parameters into a method, you might say, you tell me how many cookies you want, and I'll use that to produce what the output that you want. Instead of a recipe for 20 cookies or 40 cookies, let's say a recipe for n cookies. And simply, the math was done to modify the ingredients for using the parameter n, and here's the recipe, and n could be any valid integer. N is like a parameter. Here's another example. Suppose you were tasked to produce a line of 13 stars or 7 stars or 35 stars. You could write the code and have a for loop, right? I'm going to loop 13 times and just do a print system.out.print star right here. Can't do it 13. That method's not going to work for this one because this one's 7. So here is my for loop printing 7 times. Okay, yeah, 13 and 7 won't work for this. I need 35. And so here is another method. We're going to loop 35 times. So you see that the code is very redundant. And would variables help? Yes, tell me how many you want to print. Just like give me n for how many cookies. How many stars do you want to print? Would constants help? I don't think so. So you can get rid of this redundancy using parameters. Instead of creating a method that's line of 13 or line of 7, create a method that is going to draw for any length. When declaring the method, we will state that it requires a parameter variable for the number of stars. And then when you call the method, you need to include that as an argument. And we will call that method line. So here's main calling line and sending 7 as input. Output 7 stars. Here's main calling line with 13. Let's look at how to do this. Generally, your method header, this is a method header, and your method header so far has been starting with public, static, void. Then we make a name up, and here's the new part, type name. So type is your data type. For 7 and 13, it'll be int. And then this is just a variable name. It's called a parameter variable. I just call it parameter for short, but it's just a name you get to make up. Remember scope last week? The scope of this name is only within this method. And then there's the statements in the method. Suppose I need to call this method. Remember, maybe you had on the quiz the save raw. How do you call this method? Well, now we got something a little different because save raw on the quiz didn't have any parameter variables, but this one does. So when you call the method, it's still just the method name. But now I got to tell it what value, what integer, or what value you're going to be sending, the actual value. This could be a variable or it could be a literal. This syntax to call the method is only if it's static and public and void. So those values, though we haven't discussed it much, they do make a difference on how you're going to make your method calls. Here is our solution for the line method that will now use a parameter variable for how many stars will be printed. Here's the method header, public static void. The method name is line, and notice we're going to accept an integer and we'll call it count. Now in the loop, we'll loop count many times and we'll print a star. Here's the call, line 13. So 13 goes to count and it prints 13 stars. Line sending 7, 7 goes to count, 7 stars. Some common errors. If there is a parameter variable here, you can't call the method and leave the argument out. Or if you have an int parameter variable, you can't send a double. It has to agree in number. If there's 4 parameter variables here, you have to send 4 arguments, and it has to agree in type. In fact, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the number and type. What if you need multiple parameters for your method? What you're going to do is just create a comma-separated list. So here's my method, and name, type name, comma, type name, dot, dot, dot for how many you need. To make this method call, over here you call the method name and you're going to send a value and it's a match. The first argument has to match the type of the first parameter variable. The second argument has to match the type of the second parameter variable. So it has to agree in number and in type. In this example called print number, the first parameter variable is an integer type called number. The second is an integer type called count. Count, again, is still controlling a for loop. And what's outputting instead of a star is the number that was sent as the argument. Let's just take a look at the first example. So print number finds the method, sends the argument for. It'll be stored in the parameter variable number, sends the argument 9 stored in the parameter variable count. It will loop 9 times because count is 9, but what will output now is 4 instead of star. And here's an example of the output, and here's some more examples of calling the method. Another example is this method called box, and now my parameter variables, they're both int still, but one will be width and one will be height. The first thing this method does is call another method, and I know you're used to that now, that a method can make a call to another method. And so it's going to take the width that was sent and draw a line of that width. Then we're going to get into a loop and use height. In our loop, well, height minus 2. It's going to print 1 star. Then it's got to calculate how many spaces to print out, and it'll print a space. And it'll print then a star at the end of that, and that prints out each line for the height, and then now we'll print the bottom of the box. Here's the method call, box, 10 goes to width, 3 goes to height. It'll print out a box similar to this. Besides integer types, you can also have string types. In this example, the line will print not a star and not an integer number, but whatever value is sent in string. So the first argument is a string. Second argument, still an integer of count. We're going to loop count times, but this time we're printing the string. So here's an example of a method call using the $sign as our string. Line, that's the name of the method. $sign. It'll have to be in double quotes, okay? So it's in double quotes, so it's a string, comma, and then 12 will be the count, and it'll print a line of $12 signs. Earlier, I mentioned that you will need to know the term method signature, and this is the signature. It is the list of parameters and the order with the type inside the parenthesis. This signature is the first is a string, the second has to be an integer. This signature, it has 2 parameters, int. They're different signatures. That's important when we come to method overloading, which we'll talk about in a bit. Also, I mentioned that we'll get a little bit into when you put void here and what does that mean. So void just means this method is not going to give me any output. Let me clarify that. Output is from the method is different than writing system.out.println. So output to the method means I'm sending data back to where the method was called. And if you have void, no data is being sent back to where the method was called. Let's say you've got a method that's going to calculate a value and give you the answer. That method should return that answer. The method below returns the area of a circle. Our parameter variable is the radius of the circle. We'll call this calculate area. And notice it doesn't say void here because the area of the circle will be a double data type, and that's going to be sent back. Let's see how this method works. I'm going to create a variable that's also double, and notice it's called result, and notice the word return result. That keyword return means send this data back to where the method was called. It's returning result. Because I indicate up here that the method is a double, it's returning a double, and result is what it's returning, result has to be a double. Make that agreement happen. If you don't, you will have an error. Here's the math. Result equals math times pi times radius, or pi r squared is what that is, and it returns that result. Here is a method does not return a value. So a method that does not return a value does do a task. That's what you've been doing. You've been printing out song lyrics, for example, and that's a task. Nothing to return to where it was called. The method below has the task of printing out E-I-E-I-O. The type is void. It just has a print line. Let's talk a little bit about method names. With method names, I like to do verb noun. If it's going to do an action, what action is it doing? Calculate area. Sing vowels. Just helps in the readability and understanding what the method does. Typically, a method is unique in a class, but it doesn't have to be. I can have two methods called calculate area in the same class. However, this must be different. So if I want another way to calculate area is to send me an integer instead, that's fine. Int and double don't match, and you're allowed to do that as long as the data type and the number of parameters are different. This is known as method overloading, and it actually increases the flexibility of your source code. And I can do a calculate area where it could be a different shape. Calculate area, double radius. But I have another calculate area, and notice I have two integers. And that's okay, because this is not in agreement with that. I have another calculate area. It's a square, so they only need to send me one integer. So I could have three calculate areas in my class because the signatures are different. I can overload those methods. I can overload these methods because int double int. The signatures, even though one's an int and one's a double, and there are two parameter variables, they're in different orders, and we're okay with that. But if the method names are the same and the data types are in the same order, you will get an error. Calculate area, int base, int height. Calculate area, int length, int width. You're going to get an error because the types are in agreement here. This is a little advanced, something we'll be doing more and more of as we get along in class. Let's talk about calling a method. Once a method is written, you decide you need to execute the method. Real easy to do if it's public, static, and void and doesn't have any parameters. Okay, so here are some method calls. Sing val, draw box. I guess I'm going to draw the same size box every time because there are no arguments here. If the method has parameters, you need to decide what data is being sent to that method, and it must be sent in the correct order. Did you know every time you do system.out.println, you're calling a method called println? And you've been sending an argument to it, a string argument. In this case, hello world. You can do system.out.printf, and that requires several arguments. Very flexible printf is. Let's talk about, however, what if it's not void? What if the method does return a value? It gets a little bit more difficult to call that method. So let's look at this method header. Calculate area, double radius, and notice it's returning a double. To call that method, I'm going to create a double variable that's going to hold that result. To make the method call, it's an assignment statement now because you've got to assign the returning value to a variable. It doesn't always have to be an assignment statement, but let's say we're going to start with it being an assignment statement. Calculate area takes this 2.5, right? Goes into radius. I don't have the statements here, but let's say the answer is 12. That 12 gets returned to this. And then, well, because this is on the right-hand side of an assignment statement, it'll be stored in circle area. Public static int calculate area, because this is returning an int, I now first create a variable of type int, make the same method call, and expects an int here, so I'm sending an int here. Pretty sure the return value is 16. The 16 is returned there and gets assigned a square area. It's returning a double, so I need to create a double variable for the call, and then I'm going to call that method here on the right-hand side of an assignment statement and sending 3 numbers here, and they better be double. That will go into those parameter variables. This ends up returning, well, hopefully whatever one's highest, 40.2, let's say, and 40.2 will be returned here and then assigned to result. Here are a few more examples of returning a value. General syntax. Now we've got public static and some kind of data type, or method name parameters, but we're going to return some expression. The result of that expression has to agree with this type. This method converts from Fahrenheit to Celsius, returns a double. You're going to give me the degrees Fahrenheit, do some math, store the result in the variable degree C, and that gets returned. Degree C is a double. This is a double. It's returning a double. Here's one for a triangle. Again, doubles, and the value we're returning C is a double. You can really shorten this up a lot by just, instead of declaring a variable for the return, just return the expression. Here is a common error. Notice main is calling slope, and slope's returning some value here. However, it's not getting stored anywhere. Let's say the slope is 4.2. Now 4.2 is getting sent back, but then being forgotten because I'm not putting it anywhere. I'm not assigning it to something. To fix this common error, what you need to do is create a variable of the data type that agrees with that, and we'll call it S. Then when the call to slope returns 4.2, 4.2 gets assigned to S.